Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza, and I'm here with my personal professor and buddy Bob. How you doing, Bob?
I'm great. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes.
Live and in person in a studio.
I know, it feels so good under these nice
Seems like a
lights.
miracle, but
I mean, it is, right? It is. And we're celebrating our 5-year anniversary. So happy anniversary,
happy
Bob.
anniversary to you as well. 5 years doing this show. Who knew?
Who knew? And it all started where we are today, talking about Black history in
Yep.
Lowell. But we're going to talk about Black history broadly in Black History Month. It's February, and that's exciting. A lot of people don't know why I kind of said it before we were filming, but oh, of course, Black folks get the shortest month of the year, but they don't know where it was started. So let's go back to the beginning.
So it's fairly easy to trace because it was intentional, and it was largely done by Carter Woodson, born in 1875 of parents who had been enslaved. Becomes only the second Black person to get a PhD from Harvard University, the first being W.E.B. Du Bois. As an aside, Du Bois, after he graduated, people asked him if he felt like lucky and whatever and blessed that he had been able to go to Harvard, and he said, actually, Harvard should feel blessed that I went there, which I thought, okay, good for you, good on you. And I'm sure Carter Woodson felt exactly the same. But Woodson and people before him, there were several women, including Ida B. Wells, who had been trying to promote African American history, seeing some way to get that history out as a way to replenish and strengthen community. And they were very apt at thinking about, well, if we're not seen in the narrative, then it's much more easy for us to be marginalized. But eventually Woodson is, I think, identified more than anybody else. But I don't want to forget Black women in here too. And so he starts Black History Week, and he picks February, and he picks this particular week in February because of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And he basically sort of links the two and talks about Douglass being a champion opposing slavery, a fugitive himself who escapes north, ends up living in Massachusetts, comes to Lowell very frequently before the Civil War, and Lincoln, obviously, who's seen as, signing the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he thinks this would be the week, the second week in February would be the week that encompasses their birthdays and whatnot, and that's what we should do. And so there was never any, I've never seen anything reading about him where he thought this could turn into a month. And I don't necessarily even think he thought it would be a thing, like outside necessarily of the Black community and some white allies, I guess. But I don't think he would have imagined if he got morphed back now to think it's a month. Yeah. And so there was never obviously there was no intent on his part to say, well, let me pick the shortest month right. and do this. And so that's pretty much where it comes from. And
it didn't become a month until, I think, a few like decades after his passing. Yeah, fairly recently. I mean, it's again, it was not something. It also was not. I mean, I was trying to think back to my own sort of schooling. Obviously being the oldest person amongst the two of us, and like when did? I mean, I don't think I was trying to think about Black History Week month. Was it ever in my conscious? And it never really was until much later, after college, actually. I don't think as an undergrad, it was necessarily something that I mean, maybe it's there somewhere, but it didn't seem to be as much of an important thing as it is right now. So how about you? I was thinking about like I'll flip the switch and ask you a question. So when, like in elementary school, middle school, like where did you take this up? So I was thinking about that today, actually, about how blessed and privileged I am to have had my foundational education be rooted in Black history. So I was born here in Lowell when I was like a baby, obviously, and then I moved to Boston when I was 5, and I started kindergarten at Elliott Educational Center in Roxbury. It was also a church, but it was run by we had a Black woman who was the principal and all Black women teachers. Every morning we started
with the Ngusu Saba, which was the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. We did Harambe. We learned Swahili words. We sang the Black National Anthem every morning. And so I grew up knowing a whole lot about my culture and Black culture. It was not just a month, it was all year long. I learned about people like Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes at a very young age. And then I went to a different school that was run by mostly white folks, white women, in the same neighborhood, but it was a private, I think it was a private school, St. Joseph's, and my education was very different. And we didn't sing, lift every voice and sing. We didn't study, anything. We didn't learn about Phyllis Wheatley or anybody else, from like my history. And it was like a thing that didn't dawn on me until much later in life, when I would be talking to my friends about having Black teachers, and some of them had only maybe ever had one, if that, and didn't see any Black teachers until they were in college. So their experiences are actually very similar to yours, which is kind of unfortunate.
I mean, that is. So when you were younger, you would have maybe learned a little bit about Malcolm X, or you would have heard of him, and you would have maybe heard about somebody like William Monroe Trotter, who's a very famous, Black civil rights advocate in Boston in the 20th century.
There's a school named after him.
Right, Trotter Elementary, right? But it's funny that then it's cut off. And it's usually the other way around. My experience is more that that whole period all the way through high school is basically devoid, other than, the occasional Martin Luther King, I'm graduating high school in 1965, and so he's there, and so it's hard to sort of miss the history, but he's not lionized yet because he's not dead. And it's sad that sounds kind of cold when I say it, but that's the reality. He became much more an everyday topic in school when it was safe, because he was no longer somebody who was challenging the status quo. But it was only when I went to college. So how about, I know you went to BU, so how about there? Were there opportunities to take Black history? Was there sort of like a Black History Month? Did you notice a sort of activity on campus?
Well, Ibram Kendi wasn't there yet, so, but we did have.
Well, that's only 2 years ago. So
right,
a year ago,
exactly, so. And I graduated 10 years ago, 12 at this point. But we did have the Howard Thurman Center and the Black Unity Club, which was Umoja at the time, and that's what Umoja means, unity. And I remember. It was very interesting. It was kind of a culture shock for me. I didn't know about Black fraternities and sororities, and that was a big thing, which you wouldn't think would be a big thing on BU's very, very white campus, but it's like the power of Black people. We find ourselves wherever we are, we find that community. And I remember I got to be in like a stroll competition with like the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which is the first Black fraternity that was created. Martin Luther King was a part of it. And that was kind of a cultural shift for me, in the sense of thinking about how important my identity is and the legacy of the people who came before me. At the time, I didn't appreciate it as much, I will say, because I had that foundation, and I think having that, you don't realize how many people don't have it. And then I came to Lowell in 2012, and I think that's really when my sense of identity and my sense of the importance of Black history really started becoming a part of everything that I did. And that's how we ended up here.
Right.
During our first segment.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think back to high school, and when I learned early American history, slavery was taught almost as this benign activity. And it was taught in a way like, well, it really wasn't so bad. And it just got all lumped together with learning about the triangular trade and all these things that I look back on now with great dismay when I think about what kind of education people my age got back then. And I think it explains some of the crazy behavior now with people not wanting any of this history taught. But
banning
it's
books.
but when I got to college, I ended up taking part in a series of not confrontations in any kind of violent way, but confrontations with the college administration because no black history was taught. And so Northeastern, which is where I went to college as an undergrad, was fairly conservative. But early on in my career there, they did start teaching black history. And it was one of the first places around that had African American history courses. And so one of the books that's here, the large one on the bottom by John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom, John Hope Franklin came to my class. And I didn't know at the time how important he was. I subsequently learned, but he was sort of in the tradition of Carter Woodson and sort of really digging into this history and writing sort of a parallel, sort of the typical textbook one would get when they were learning U.S. history. Well, he wrote a black history, sort of going through the time period, and he came and he was a very impressive person. But again, I didn't know what I didn't know. Right. And I didn't know I was in the presence, in a way, of historical royalty, because that's really how most people in the profession think of him. And then a second person came, this guy Herbert Aptheker, who, again, naive at the time, but he was introduced as a Marxist historian. And I wasn't really too clear on what that actually was either in my early educational career. And he had written a book on black slave revolts. And this is a thick book full of resistance to the institution of slavery. And I'm thinking, wait, all this time I had been taught that it really wasn't that bad, and people didn't protest. And that's how you know it really wasn't that bad, because people didn't protest. But that's partly because nobody was teaching that actual history. And so he came and he talked. And we read in this course I was in, this book on it's called American Negro Slave Revolts. It sort of dates in terms of using the word Negro, right? But again, that was, I'm sitting there thinking, whoa, like all this stuff I don't know.
Right.
And so for me, it really started this kind of a journey of, okay, what else did I get shortchanged? What else didn't I get taught, right? Yeah. And so here we are.
Yeah, I had like a similar, well, not even, it's kind of similar, but not really. I took a sociology class and I was just learning about the words for things. I didn't even have words to describe my experience. And I had no idea that you're taught in the black family, and I don't know if this is a thing for everybody, but I know all of the black folks that I know, education is a privilege because we were denied it for so long, and it's a part of who you are. You sit there, you watch Roots, that's like a family event, and we talk about, or Rosewood, and we talk about what happened and why it's so important that, you reach for the stars. You have to be twice as good to be considered, even half. And like the whole notion of even black excellence stems from not being seen, And I remember we were watching a clip of a documentary about racism in Brazil, and it suddenly hit my brain, I never even thought about black people in the diaspora. I didn't even know that there was a I didn't even consider it because it was never taught. I never thought about what happened before slavery. I never thought about free folks here in America at the same time as slavery who had never been enslaved. And some things I didn't even learn until we did the Juneteenth special. So there's still things that I'm just like, oh my God. And a lot of our history is always so focused on slavery. And that's the other thing that I think gets to me is just, we're so much more than our struggle, and we are so much more because of our struggle and black history. And and then when I hear people want to take it out of schools, or they want to ban books that display any kind of oppression, or you can't say things that make other people feel divisive between the oppressors and the oppressed, and you don't want to give people this sense of victimhood, and you don't want to make people feel bad. But it's not about making people feel bad. It's about educating yourself and learning more. So when you got that education and you were there protesting and trying to get like Black history studies happening. How did that feel for you as a white person in the world, especially during that time?
Yeah, and I don't think I thought about it that way at all. I just think I thought about it as it made sense to do this, and I was being shortchanged if the history wasn't being taught. I think now people might be, a white person like me now might think twice about being like out there and an advocate in a way, like, wait, is it my place to be doing this or that? Mm-hmm. But I think it was a different time too, and it wasn't, didn't really think about it that much other than this, we need this and it's not being taught. So how do we figure out how to get it taught? Also, the fact is that Northeastern was probably 95% white, even though it backed up onto Roxbury and Mission Hill. So there wasn't it wasn't as though there was a large Black population in the mid-60s that was, also we're just on the verge of busing struggles in Boston that are right on the backyard of the school. And I'm aware of all these things, and they don't, again, to your point of the language, I don't have a language to understand it. It doesn't make sense to me, and it seems wrong. And that's, but like thinking of diaspora or whatever, that's like not a word I would have known at the time. It wasn't anything I was thinking about. It just seemed like, well, wait, this just doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, I want to know more about why. And that was like my kind of intellectual curiosity. The same way in the same time period, people were pushing hard for women's history. Mm-hmm. Right, and then people have to really push, and I think this still happens, people have to push hard still for women's history within Black history, within Latinx history. Mm-hmm. It still ends up having women's stories left out, which is always why I want to talk about someone like Ida Tarbell and her struggle against lynching and those sorts of things, right, because those tend to get dropped out. But it's really hard, and now, to your point earlier, there's 37 states, 37 out of 50, that are debating whether or not to curtail the teaching of Black history in some way, either dictating what books can be used or not used, or topics covered, or people not to be covered, or in some way to interfere with teachers deciding what's going to happen in their classroom. That's pretty serious.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a detriment not just to young Black kids, but to all kids. We live in a very diverse world. The reality is that we are living with other people, and you should want to understand their experiences and how, yes, we have similar experiences, but we should be able to acknowledge and celebrate our differences as well, and how you got here and why it's important that you're here sitting in this classroom next to me, and I think that when you don't see yourself represented, we talked about this a little bit already, then you just don't know. And I think that was Carter Woodson's mentality as well. Mm-hmm. And he was obviously an educator, and educators, I feel like, are always saving the day when they're doing it right. And that's why I'm grateful that you are my personal educator and that you're out here challenging the status quo and doing it for your students. I count myself as one of your students, but but we need people like that who do have some privilege and power to do these kinds of things. And then we need people like you to also support the efforts of community folks like me, or people like Krista and Masada.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Let's.
Yes. So
you're in there, right?
I'm in there.
Okay.
I'm in there.
All right.
And I definitely talk about what it's like to be a Black Lowellian. And reading some of these stories, you don't even know, again, the importance of the stories being told. I know Masada, when she started the Kindred Project a few years back, we wanted to do this thing for the Black community to unite and uplift and empower. And then reading these stories, there were people doing that here in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. There were people who were facing all kinds of prejudice and wild discrimination. And then we talked about urban renewal and the demolishing destruction of Black neighborhoods. That's spoken about in here. There are people who were the first Black teacher in some of the Lowell schools. And you don't even think about that, these people still being around today. They're here.
Right.
And their stories matter.
Yep.
And I love the title because it's hidden in plain sight. There are parts of it that talk about how it's a thing that we've said on the show. We talk about the Industrial Revolution, the mill girls as being such an integral part of Lowell's history, but we don't talk about why that industry was allowed to happen, where the cloth came from, the cotton came from, or where did it go, and we talk about that. And it's so exciting that we get to, and there's an exhibit at the Lowell National Historical Parks right across the way, and you can see these things, you can read this book, you can buy this book. And
so it's for sale in the park?
Yes.
And at the Visitor Center?
At the Visitor Center and the freesoilarts.org. You can go on their website. I think that it's so important that we're doing this work right now, but there's a part in there that asks a few of the participants, did you know about the Underground Railroad here? Or what do you know about Lowell's Black history? And people talk about me and you and how they didn't know about it until they went on one of your walks or they found out about it through our show, and I mean, I'm so honored that we're doing this work, but it kind of bums me out.
Yeah, well, that goes back to the same question from, Northeastern, or your 3 years, your formative years, as I wish I could have seen you as a little kid, your formative years there and, in that school, and then sort of shifting over, right? I mean, and in some ways, I think Woodson would have, and John Hope Franklin and other people, Ida B. Wells, these other people we've talked about today, would have been just as happy if this history was just part of the history, right? But it's demonstrative, I think, of this problem, right? Which is why, we did a show a little while ago about Latinx history and how that's not there either. And we rob ourselves of that richness by not having that history taught. And so I love this book, and the fact that it happened is really wonderful, because I think it does show the importance of history, the signage project around town. There's a lot that's happening, which is really, really good. And so I think that that's partly the way to sort of show the states that are debating, should we teach this or not? Well, of course you should. And you have your own, I love the title too, because all these states that are fighting this have the history within their state. They just don't realize it. And it doesn't have to be, which I think you said a couple minutes ago, it doesn't have to be polarizing. Teaching this doesn't have to make it end up, I mean, when I'm teaching this now, I'm teaching this history now with my students in my U.S. History Survey class. I'm not teaching it to them because I want them to feel bad. I'm teaching it to them because I want them to become concerned enough to understand that history, that as they grow older and have families and live their lives, they're more aware, more cognizant, more fair. And that, I mean, I teach it that way. I ask them always, does this seem fair? Does this seem right to you? Does it seem right to you that the Constitution says these things, but here's these whole groups of people that don't get those things? Is it fair that the GI Bill gets passed after World War II, but black veterans don't get the benefits of the GI Bill? Does that seem fair to you? And they'll always say no, because people, I think, deep down, if pushed, will try, most people, I shouldn't say all people, will try to be fair. And then I say, okay, so then what do we do?
Yes.
Right? And but if we didn't teach it, I mean, I don't know. I mean, at Northeastern, the person that was teaching the Black History courses, I got to know pretty well. Donald Jacobs was his name. And he kept encouraging me to do a research project my senior year. And I hadn't thought that much about it. And so he said, go to the Boston Public Library, go in the rare book room, and ask them to give you copies of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And sit there for an hour and read the paper. And then come back and talk to me about, do you want to do a research paper? And so I sat in the Boston Public Library in the rare book room with little white gloves on, reading the original of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. I'm reading about Lowell. I'm reading about Douglass and Lowell, and I'm reading about women abolitionists. I'm never thinking I'm going to end up teaching it. It's like so far into the future, but that's what I'm reading. And I went back to him and said, yeah, I'm hooked. And I did my senior honors thesis on Garrison and the Liberator.
Wow.
And so here we are, like how many decades later when we do this documentary, and you know, come to find out, Garrison is really important in Lowell, as are all these other characters like Frederick Douglass and so many freedom seekers who end up here. And so it's like doing the show, it sort of closes the loop in a way, but it also aggravates, I guess I can say hell on LTC, right? It aggravates the hell out of me that we have to defend, like that a book like this would have to be defended to be in a school. Just seems like crazy.
It really feels like we're going backwards in some ways, and it doesn't make sense. The whole reason that there are these disparities, you can't just say, you know, oh, well, that's not fair that this is happening. Even to groups that don't look like me, even to privileged groups or groups that aren't marginalized because of their race, but they may be marginalized for other reasons. There are reasons, and it goes back, and you need to know that history. You think that we're so different, but we're actually very, very similar. We're both being disenfranchised in some kind of way because of discriminatory policies. And if you don't learn that history and you don't learn how we were systematically separated in terms of our identities, then you won't really know what you're even fighting for or fighting against. And diversity is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go away. Like, people aren't just going to go back to Africa or go back to your islands or whatever the case. We're here. We're all here. Black history is American history.
Yep.
And it's all a part of the inception of where we all come from. And so we have to learn it.
Yeah, I mean, and in point of fact, Lowell in the last census is now a majority city of persons of color.
Get out of here.
Yeah, the white population is under 50%.
Well, that would explain some of the fear.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's part of it, right? I mean, I think that got amped up in the previous presidential administration, and it everything sort of got posed that way, and that if people learn this stuff, then they're going to come and take your stuff away. And that's not what people, at least as far as I can see, that's not what people who write these books that are here on the table, that's not what they're saying. They're saying we need to think about it and we need to make it right. And that's going to take a variety of forms and incredibly complicated conversations. But it's not as though, you know, people are calling for, you know, violence. Or I mean, that's really coming the other way.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, I'm hoping this becomes a bestseller. And that it sells out and they have to go into a second printing and a third printing, and that this is in every school in Lowell, that particularly at the high school, this becomes part of the curriculum, that the people in the book, such as yourself, are, you know, on speaking tours around the city and schools. I think it's time that we really sort of, that the city sometimes says it embraces this stuff. So actually, really, like saying it and doing it are two different things. So step up.
Exactly. Step up, put your money where your mouth is. And I think I said it in the book, put your privilege where your mouth is. And just, you know, if we really are going to build strong communities, then it takes everybody in the community. And it takes us all working together. And the only way that we can do that is if we acknowledge where we've come from. And that's how we move forward.
Yep.
So,
amen.
Thank you, Bob. As always, it is
my pleasure.
An incredible pleasure and an honor. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell.